Jacob Winters hadn't been to Bitter Creek in 6 months. The town was too loud, too alive, full of people who expected him to be something he wasn't anymore. But his supplies were running low, and Winter and the Bighorns didn't forgive a man who came unprepared. The January morning bit deep as he rode Thunder down the mountain trail. 15 miles of frozen earth and snow-laden pines separated his cabin from civilization. The temperature hovered near 10 below, cold enough that his breath clouded white and thick, cold enough that the leather reins felt like iron bars in his gloved hands. The silence of the high country wrapped around him like a familiar coat. No voices, no questions, just the crunch of Thunder's hooves breaking through crusted snow and the whisper of wind through ancient trees. Jacob was 42 years old and felt 70. The war had aged him. Losing Elizabeth and Lily had hollowed him out. For 10 years he lived on this mountain trapping and hunting, speaking to no one but his horse and the occasional trader. It was a half-life, but it was his. The mountain asked nothing of him except survival, and survival was something he could manage. Living was different. Living required hope, and hope had died with his family. The trading post came into view as the trail descended. Bitter Creek wasn't much, just a scattering of weathered buildings huddled against the wind. The main street was frozen mud rutted with wagon tracks. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys. Jacob could hear voices even from a distance, the sound making his jaw tighten. He guided Thunder to the hitching post outside Carson's trading post and dismounted, his joints stiff from the cold ride. Helen Carson looked up when the door opened, her round face breaking into a smile that Jacob didn't return. She was a good woman, kind-hearted, the type who couldn't help but try to draw people out of their shells. Jacob had resisted her efforts for a decade. "Mr. Winters, haven't seen you since summer. Thought maybe the mountain finally claimed you." Still breathing, his voice came out rough, unused. "Need supplies, flour, salt, ammunition, coffee, sugar." Helen's smile dimmed slightly but didn't disappear. She began gathering items, wrapping them in brown paper, her hands quick and efficient. Her husband Jack emerged from the back room, nodded at Jacob. The two men had an understanding. Jack didn't push for conversation, and Jacob paid in cash. "Shame about Daniel Hayes," Helen said as she measured out flour. The words were casual, but Jacob caught the weight behind them. "Found him frozen behind Rusty's saloon last week. Drunk, they say. Just laid down in the snow and never got up. Left that poor daughter of his with nothing but debts." Jacob's hand stilled on the counter. He didn't look up. "That's so. Silas Hayes, Daniel's brother, he's claiming ownership of the debts. Says Clara owes what her father couldn't pay. Word is he's planning to sell her at auction. Settle the accounts that way." The flour sack crinkled under Jacob's grip. "Sell her. It's legal, unfortunately. Territorial debt laws. If a man dies owing money and leaves kin, the debt transfers. Clara's got no property, no husband, no means. Silas can claim her labor to settle it." Helen's voice dropped. "It's wrong, Mr. Winters, but it's legal." Jacob said nothing. He finished paying for his supplies, loaded them onto Thunder's back. The information settled in his mind like a stone dropped into still water. Not his business, not his problem. He'd come for supplies, not complications. But as he led Thunder down the street toward the blacksmith, Helen's words followed him. "That poor daughter, nothing but debts, planning to sell her." The blacksmith needed 3 days to reshoe Thunder properly. Jacob told himself that was why he stayed. Told himself it had nothing to do with a woman he'd never met being sold like livestock. He took a room above the saloon, the cheapest place in town, and tried not to listen to the laughter and music drifting up from below. Tried not to think about Elizabeth's voice, her last words to him 10 years ago, as fever burned through her. "Promise me you'll live, Jacob. Really live. Not just survive." He'd broken that promise every day since. On the third morning, Jacob woke to voices in the street. A crowd was gathering in the town square. He dressed slowly, pulling on his heavy coat, his gut tight with something he didn't want to name. When he stepped outside, the cold hit him like a fist, but he barely noticed. His eyes were on the platform that had been erected in the center of the square. The auction block. Jacob positioned himself at the edge of the crowd, 50 or 60 people stamping their feet against the cold breath fogging in the air. The mood was ugly, excited. People came to auctions for entertainment, for the spectacle. It reminded Jacob of the war of crowds gathering to watch men die. He'd hated it then. He hated it now. Then he saw her. Clara Hayes was tall, taller than most women, with a frame that spoke of strength rather than delicacy. She was heavy-set, her body large in a world that prized smallness, and Jacob could see from 50 feet away how she held herself, shoulder square, chin level, refusing to cower even as her uncle dragged her toward the platform by a chain attached to iron shackles on her wrists. The shackles were what stopped Jacob's breath. Real iron shackles, the kind used on prisoners, the kind that cut into skin and left scars. Her wrists were already raw, bleeding in places where the metal had bitten deep. She'd been shackled overnight, maybe longer, treated like a criminal for the crime of being born to the wrong father. But it was her eyes that held him, brown eyes that blazed with fury even as her body trembled from cold and fear. She wasn't broken, not yet. She was a fighter who hadn't quit, and something in Jacob's chest, something he'd thought long dead, twisted hard. Silas Hayes was a weasel of a man, thin and sharp-featured, with the kind of smile that made honest men check their pockets. He hauled Clara onto the platform like she was a sack of grain, his grip on her arm leaving white marks that would turn to bruises. "Gentlemen," Silas's voice cut through the morning air, 240 pounds of workhorse. Strong back can haul water, split wood cook for a crew, don't eat much despite appearances. Laughter rippled through the crowd, cruel casual laughter that treated a woman's humiliation as entertainment. Jacob's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. Clara's face flushed red, but her chin stayed level. She stared at a point above the crowd's heads, somewhere distant, somewhere that wasn't here. Jacob recognized that look. He'd worn it himself on battlefields when the only choice was to endure. "Starting bid $50, Silas's grin widened. "Who'll pay to settle Daniel Hayes's debts and get themselves a worker in the bargain?" Silence stretched for a moment. Then a voice from the back slurred with morning whiskey. "Wouldn't pay 15 for that cow." More laughter, louder now. Clara's hands fisted at her sides, the chains clinking softly. Jacob saw her jaw work, saw her swallow hard, saw her refuse to break. "Come now, gentlemen. $60 and you got yourself help through spring." A rancher Jacob vaguely recognized raised his hand. 75. The man's name was Cobb. Jacob knew him by reputation. Mean drunk, worked his horses into the ground and did worse to anything weaker. The thought of Clara in that man's hands made Jacob's vision narrow. Silas was opening his mouth to call the bid when Jacob's feet moved. He didn't plan it, didn't think it through. His body simply responded to something deeper than thought, deeper than the careful walls he'd built around himself. His boots struck the wooden platform steps, heavy and deliberate. The crowd parted instinctively. Jacob Winters was a known figure in these parts, the mountain man, the ghost who lived alone and spoke to no one. There were stories about him. Some true, most not. But all of them agreed on one thing: he was not a man to cross. Jacob didn't look at the crowd, didn't acknowledge Silas's startled expression. He looked directly at Clara, and her eyes met his. For 2 heartbeats, they stared at each other, and Jacob saw everything he needed to see. Not pity or pleading, not a broken spirit waiting for rescue. He saw rage and dignity warring behind those brown eyes. He saw a fighter. He saw someone worth saving. Elizabeth would want this. The thought came unbidden but certain. Elizabeth, who'd run from her wealthy family to marry a nobody soldier. Elizabeth, who'd chosen freedom over comfort. Elizabeth, who'd made him promise to live. Jacob reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. The weight of it represented half a year's trapping income money he'd saved for supplies for security for the long, empty years ahead. He didn't hesitate. He dropped the pouch between Silas's boots with a sound like a judge's gavel. "Cash." The single word fell into absolute silence. Silas scrambled for the pouch, fingers fumbling with the drawstring. When he saw the gold double eagles inside, his eyes went wide. Real money, not the worn silver and promissory notes that most frontier business ran on. 200, Silas nearly shouted, greed overcoming surprise. Sold too. He squinted at Jacob. "Don't believe I caught your name, mister." "You didn't." Jacob turned to Clara, extending one broad, scarred hand. His voice, when it came, was quiet enough that only she could hear. "Can you walk?" Clara stared at his hand. It was calloused, weathered, the hand of a man who worked with his body. The knuckles were scarred from old fights. But it was steady, absolutely steady. She looked up at his face, trying to read the trap, the trick. the inevitable cruelty hiding behind the question. "I asked if you can walk," Jacob repeated. There was no impatience in his tone, just fact. "Yes." Her voice came out smaller than she wanted, rougher from the cold and the fear she wouldn't show. "Then come on." He didn't grab her, didn't pull or yank or drag. He simply turned and walked down the platform steps, clearly expecting her to follow. Clara's legs moved before her mind caught up. The crowd parted again, people stepping back from Jacob like he carried some invisible force that couldn't be crossed. She stumbled on the bottom step, the shackles throwing off her balance. Jacob's hand shot out fast despite his size, catching her elbow and steadying her without breaking stride. "Keys." He didn't look back at Silas. "What? The shackles? Keys now." There was something in that voice, something cold and final, that made Silas's hand move to his vest pocket without conscious thought. He tossed a small iron key toward them. Jacob caught it one-handed, his movements economical, precise. He knelt in the frozen mud of the street. Clara felt her breath catch as this massive man, this stranger who just paid $200 in gold for her, lowered himself to the ground and reached for her shackles. His fingers were quick, efficient. The lock clicked open. The iron fell away from her wrists, leaving red marks and the ghost sensation of weight. Clara rubbed her wrists, barely believing they were free. The metal had cut deep in places. She'd thought she'd wear those shackles to her grave. Now they lay in the mud, discarded, meaningless. "You got a name?" Jacob asked, rising to his full height. He was enormous up close, built like the mountains themselves had taken human form. Clara swallowed. "Clara. Clara Hayes." He nodded once. "Jacob Winters." He gestured toward a massive draft horse tied to the hitching post, a beast as large and silent as its owner. "Mount up." Clara looked at the horse, then at Jacob, then back at the dispersing crowd. This was it, the moment where her ownership transferred from one man to another, where whatever fresh hell awaited her would begin. Her stomach twisted, but what choice did she have? Run. She had nowhere to go. No money, no allies. Winter would kill her before she made it 10 miles. She put her foot in the stirrup. Jacob had to help hoist her up. The horse was so tall. She settled into the saddle, her body aching from the cold and the rough treatment. A moment later, Jacob swung up behind her with the ease of a man who'd spent more time on horseback than on foot. His arm came around her waist. Not tight, not possessive. Just enough to steady her as he took the reins. "Hold on," he said quietly. Then they were moving the horse's gait smooth despite its size, carrying them out of Bitter Creek and into the mountains beyond. They rode in silence for over an hour. Clara tried to speak twice. Once to ask where they were going, once to ask what he expected of her. But both times the words died in her throat, choked by fear and uncertainty. Jacob didn't seem inclined toward conversation anyway. He guided the horse up narrow trails that wound between pine trees heavy with snow, following paths that didn't look like paths at all. The temperature dropped as they climbed. Clara's thin dress, the same torn and mud-caked thing she'd worn for weeks, was no match for mountain cold. Soon she was shivering so hard her teeth chattered, her whole body trembling in waves she couldn't control. She tried to hide it, tried to stay still, but the cold was relentless. She felt Jacob shift behind her. Then his heavy bear-skin coat settled over her shoulders, his arms still coming around her to hold the reins. The sudden warmth was almost painful. Clara's eyes burned with unexpected tears. "Thank you," she managed through chattering teeth. He grunted. Not quite a "you're welcome," not quite acknowledgement, but not dismissive either, just sound. The sun was setting, painting the snow gold and pink when they finally emerged into a clearing. A cabin stood at the center, solid log construction smoke rising from a stone chimney. A small barn sat off to one side. It looked lived in, but lonely, like it had been waiting for something to happen. Jacob dismounted first, then helped Clara down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground, stiff from cold and the long ride. He steadied her again with that same impersonal efficiency, then led the horse toward the barn. "Inside," he called over his shoulder. "Doors open." Oh, Clara walked to the cabin on numb feet and pushed the door open. Warmth hit her like a physical thing. A fire roared in the hearth. Oil lamps were already lit. The smell of wood smoke and something cooking in a pot over the fire filled the air. The interior was simple but clean. One main room with a table, chairs, a kitchen area, and a bed in the far corner. A ladder led to what looked like a loft space above. She stood just inside the doorway, not sure where she was allowed to go, what she was allowed to touch. This was the moment. This was where the demands would start, where she'd learn what price she'd really paid for those $200. Jacob came in a few minutes later, stamping snow off his boots. He closed the door, latched it, then moved to the fire and stirred whatever was in the pot. The silence stretched. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Finally, Jacob straightened and turned to face her. "You hungry?" The question was so unexpected, so ordinary, that Clara could only nod. He ladled stew into two bowls, set them on the table with a chunk of bread, and gestured for her to sit. She did, slowly, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Jacob sat across from her and started eating. Not watching her, not making demands, just eating like it was the most normal thing in the world. Clara picked up her spoon with shaking hands and tasted the stew. It was good, simple but hearty venison and root vegetables. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, and her body took over, hunger eclipsing caution. She ate until the bowl was empty, soaking up the last of the gravy with bread. When she finished, Jacob stood, took both bowls to the wash basin and set them aside. Then he moved to a large wooden tub in the corner near the fire. Clara hadn't noticed it before. He began hauling buckets of water from a kettle on the hearth, pouring steaming water until the tub was half full. Clara's heart started pounding again. Here it was. Jacob straightened, wiped his hands on his pants, and looked at her with those unreadable gray eyes. "Take off everything." The words hit Clara like a fist. Her breath caught. This was it. The cruelty she'd been waiting for, dressed up in hot water and false kindness. She stood, legs trembling, trying to find words, trying to find anger or courage or anything except the sick terror spreading through her chest. "Take off everything," Jacob repeated, his voice still level, still calm. "Every stitch. Those clothes are filth and shame, and you don't wear them in my house." Clara's vision swam. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. This man had bought her. He owned her now in every way that mattered, and she had nowhere to run. Jacob watched her for a moment, then his expression shifted just barely, like a crack in stone. He sighed and reached to the bed and pulled a clean wool blanket from the pile there. "I'll be outside," he said quietly, his voice gentler than before. He held the blanket out to her. "Tubs for you, soaps on the shelf. When you're clean and dry, there's clothes laid out on the bed, shirt, pants, socks. They'll be big, but they're warm. Put them on." He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the latch. "You're not a possession here, Clara. You're a person who got dealt a rotten hand and needs time to heal. That's all." He walked out and closed the door behind him. The latch clicked softly. Clara stood frozen, staring at the door, at the blanket in her hands, at the tub of steaming water. Slowly, like waking from a nightmare, she moved to the door and tested the latch. It opened easily. No lock, no trap. She closed it again and turned back to the room. The tub waited, steam rising in lazy curls. On the bed, she could see the clothes he'd mentioned. Clean, whole, hers if she wanted them. Clara's hands trembled as she began to undress. The rags fell away like snakeskin, torn dress, threadbare chemise, stockings more whole than fabric. Each piece represented months of degradation, of being told she was worthless, of carrying shame in her own body. She stepped into the hot water and nearly sobbed at the shock of it. Heat soaked into muscles that had been cold and tense for so long, she'd forgotten what warmth felt like. She sank down until the water covered her shoulders, and something inside her chest that had been locked tight for years finally slowly began to unknot. Clara scrubbed until her skin was pink and raw, until the water turned gray with grime and shame. She washed her hair 3 times using the rough soap that smelled like lye and pine. The scent was clean, honest. When she was finally done, truly clean, for the first time in months, she climbed out and dried herself with the blanket Jacob had left. The clothes on the bed were exactly as he'd described. A wool shirt soft from washing, canvas pants that would need rolling at the cuffs, thick socks, all too large, all clean and whole. Clara put them on her fingers, clumsy with emotions she didn't want to name. When she was dressed, she stood there feeling like a stranger in her own skin. A knock at the door made her jump. "Decent?" Jacob's voice came through the wood. "Yes." He came back in, glanced at her once in a quick assessment that held no judgment, and nodded. "Good. You can sleep in the loft. There's blankets up there and it stays warm from the fire below. I'll be down here." Clara found her voice rough and uncertain. Why did you buy me? Jacob was quiet for a long moment. He moved to the fire, added another log, his movements deliberate. When he finally spoke, he didn't look at her. I didn't buy you. I bought your freedom from a man who didn't deserve to own it. He straightened. What you do with that freedom is your choice. He finally met her eyes. But winter in the mountains is hard. You won't survive it alone. So here's the deal. You work, I work. You eat, I eat. You sleep safe. I sleep knowing I didn't leave someone to freeze to death in Silas's hands. His gaze was direct, honest. Come spring, if you want to leave, you leave. No debt, no obligation. I'll even give you money for the trail. A pause heavy with meaning. And if you stay, then you stay. Clara stared at him. It was the simplest, strangest contract she'd ever heard. No marriage, no servitude, just survival and choice. I don't understand you, she whispered. Jacob's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. You don't have to. You just have to sleep and get your strength back. We'll talk more in the morning. He banked, the fire blew out most of the lamps, and settled into a chair by the hearth with a blanket and a rifle across his lap. Guard position. Not watching her. Watching the door. Clara climbed the ladder to the loft. She found a nest of blankets already laid out, still warm from the rising heat of the fire below. She burrowed into them, her body exhausted but her mind racing. Outside, wind howled through the pines. Inside, for the first time in months, maybe years, Clara Hayes closed her eyes and slept without fear. She didn't know it yet, but this was the first night of her real life. Morning came with pale light and the smell of coffee. Clara woke disoriented, the loft beams unfamiliar above her, the warmth and safety so foreign, she almost thought she'd dreamed the whole thing. Then she heard movement below, the clank of a pile, the scrape of a chair. Reality settled back into place. She climbed down the ladder to find Jacob at the stove frying eggs and salt pork. He glanced up when she appeared. Coffee's ready. Cups are on the shelf. Clara poured herself a cup. Strong black scalding. She sat at the table. Jacob brought over 2 plates of food and sat across from her just like last night. Sleep all right, he asked. Better than I have in a long time. He nodded. Good. They ate. Clara kept waiting for the demands to start, for the expectations to be laid out. But Jacob just finished his breakfast, drained his coffee, and stood. I've got to check the trap lines today, he said, pulling on his coat. You can come with me if you want, or you can stay here. Either way, don't touch the rifle unless something tries to come through the door. And if you go outside, don't wander past the clearing. Easy to get lost in the woods if you don't know them. What should I do? Clara asked. Jacob paused, one arm in his coat sleeve. Whatever you want. Rest. Read, there's books on the shelf. Cook if you're hungry. He met her eyes. This is your home now, Clara. Act like it. Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Clara sat in the quiet cabin holding her coffee cup, trying to wrap her mind around the fact that she'd just been given freedom and didn't know what to do with it. She started small, washed the dishes, swept the floor, straightened the blankets in the loft. Then with growing confidence, she began to explore. Really explore. The cabin was stocked with provisions, firewood stacked neatly, books on a shelf worn from reading, tools organized with care. Everything spoke of a man who valued order and self-sufficiency, but there was a loneliness to it too. No photographs, no letters, no signs that anyone but Jacob had ever lived here. By midday, Clara had worked up the courage to step outside. The clearing was beautiful in daylight, ringed by towering pines, snow sparkling under a clear sky. The mountains rose in the distance like silent sentinels. The barn held Jacob's draft horse, a milk cow, and a few chickens scratching in the straw. Clara fed them from the grain bin, murmuring softly, and felt something unknot in her chest. She was useful here, not because someone forced her to be, but because she chose to be. When Jacob returned near sunset, his arms full of rabbits and pine marten pelts, he found the cabin warm, fresh bread cooling on the table, and Clara sitting by the fire mending a tear in one of his shirts she'd found. He stopped in the doorway, snow dusting his shoulders, and just looked at the scene. You didn't have to do all this, he said quietly. Clara set down the sewing. I know, I wanted to. Something passed between them in that moment. Understanding, maybe, or the first fragile thread of trust. Jacob nodded, hung up his coat, and set to work skinning the day's catch at the table. Clara went back to her sewing. The evening unfolded in companionable silence, two people learning the rhythm of sharing space without fear. The days turned into weeks. Clara learned the mountain's rhythms. She rose with the dawn tended. The animals helped Jacob where she could. The work was hard, but it was hers. No one mocked her. No one called her worthless. Jacob asked her to do things never commanded. And when she finished a task, he'd nod or say, "Good work," in that gruff way of his. She learned other things too. That Jacob had been a trapper for 15 years, living alone since his wife and daughter died of fever a decade ago. That he spoke more to the animals than to people. That he was handy with tools, patient with the broken things, and surprisingly gentle when one of the chickens got a hurt wing. He never touched her except to help her over rough ground or hand her something across the table. And slowly, so slowly, she almost didn't notice, Clara began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was safe. One night about a month after her arrival, they sat by the fire after supper. Jacob was carving a new handle for a knife, and Clara was reading one of his books, a collection of Shakespeare plays worn soft from use. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said. Jacob didn't look up from his carving. "Go ahead. Why do you live up here alone?" His hand stilled for a moment. Then he resumed carving, wood shavings curling away from the blade. When he spoke, his voice was measured, careful. "After my family died, town felt too loud. Too many voices. Too many people who wanted to know how I was doing or tell me time would heal it." He tested the handle's curve with his thumb. "Mountains don't ask questions. Don't expect you to be anything but what you are. Do you ever get lonely?" "Every day." He said it simply, like stating the weather. "But lonely is better than what I was in town. There I was hollow. Up here, I'm just alone. There's a difference." Clara thought about that. "I think I understand. I was lonely too, even surrounded by people." Jacob glanced at her. "Loneliness isn't about how many people are around. It's about whether anybody sees you." The words hit Clara square in the chest, because yes, that was exactly it. In Bitter Creek, she'd been invisible, even when people were staring. A body, a joke, never a person. "You see me," she said softly. Jacob set down the knife and the handle, his full attention on her for the first time all evening. "I see you." His voice was quiet but certain. "And for what it's worth, Clara, what I see is someone strong enough to survive hell and still find kindness in her. That's worth more than all the gold in my pouch." Clara's eyes burned. She looked away, blinking hard. "Thank you," she whispered. Jacob nodded and went back to his carving. But something had shifted between them. A wall coming down, a door opening just a crack. That night, Clara climbed to the loft with tears in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the strange, unfamiliar feeling of being valued. Below, Jacob settled into his chair and stared into the fire, thinking about promises made to the dead and the possibility, however faint, that the living might still have something to offer each other. Outside, the mountain winds sang through the pines. Inside, two broken people had taken the first step toward becoming whole. February brought the worst blizzard Jacob had seen in 5 years. The storm hit without warning, wall of white that turned day into twilight and made the world beyond the cabin windows disappear. Wind hammered the walls hard enough to make the whole structure shudder. Snow piled against the door in drifts that reached past Jacob's waist. He moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, his body remembering survival routines learned during the war and honed through years alone. He reinforced the roof beams from inside, wedging support posts against the ceiling where the wood groaned under accumulating snow. The fire had to stay roaring, which meant burning through wood at a dangerous rate. He dragged in every log from the covered pile outside, stacking them near the hearth until there was barely room to walk. The temperature outside dropped to 30 below. Inside, even with the fire blazing, frost formed on the windows in intricate patterns. Jacob made a decision that would have been unthinkable a month ago. He brought the animals inside. Thunder came first, the big draft horse, surprisingly docile, as Jacob led him through the door and into the corner farthest from the fire. Then Bessie, the milk cow, her breath steaming in the sudden warmth. Finally, the chickens, squawking and confused, settled into a makeshift pen Jacob fashioned from wooden crates. The cabin became a barn, crowded and pungent, but alive. Warm bodies generating heat, sharing survival. Clara helped without being asked, spreading straw for the animals, filling buckets with water from the rapidly depleting supply. They worked side by side, not speaking, the howl of wind outside, making conversation impossible anyway. Hours passed. The storm showed no signs of breaking. Night fell, though it was hard to tell the difference. Jacob checked the loft and came back down, shaking his head. Too cold up there. Dangerous. Clara nodded, her face pale. She'd been shivering for the last hour despite being near the fire. The loft, normally kept warm by rising heat, had become an icebox. The wind found every crack in the logs up there, turning it into a wind tunnel. Jacob spread blankets on the floor by the hearth. His movements were matter-of-fact practical. Army training had taught him that body heat shared was body heat preserved. We'll sleep down here tonight. Warmer. He laid out his bearskin coat, then several wool blankets, creating a nest close enough to the fire to benefit from its heat, but not so close as to be dangerous. Then he lay down on the far edge, a good 3 feet of space between where he settled and where the rest of the blankets waited. Clara stood frozen, old fears rising despite everything she'd learned about this man over the past month. Jacob seemed to sense her hesitation without looking at her. His eyes were already closed. Lie down, he said quietly. We'll freeze separately or survive together. Your choice, wife tree. The words were blunt but not unkind. Clara looked at the space he'd left, at his carefully turned back, at the way he'd positioned himself to give her as much room as possible. She thought about the loft, about the cold that was already making her bones ache. She thought about how Jacob had never once touched her without purpose, never looked at her with anything but respect. She lay down, pulling blankets over herself, feeling the heat from the fire on one side and the warmth radiating from Jacob's large frame on the other. It was the closest that they'd been since that first ride up the mountain. She could hear his breathing, slow and steady, could smell wood smoke and pine and the clean scent of honest work. Jacob, her voice was barely a whisper. Yeah, thank you. Go to sleep, Clara. But his voice was softer than usual, gentler. And as exhaustion finally pulled her under, Clara felt something she hadn't felt since her mother died. Safe. Sometime in the deepest part of night, Clara's body betrayed her careful distance. Cold penetrated even the blankets, even the fire's warmth. In sleep, seeking heat with an instinct older than thought, she rolled toward the source of warmth, toward Jacob. He woke instantly, soldier reflexes honed by war and a decade of sleeping light in case of predators. For a moment he didn't move, didn't breathe. Clara's head rested on his shoulder. Her arm was across his chest. In sleep, her face had relaxed, the constant tension she carried melted away. She looked younger, peaceful. Every muscle in Jacob's body locked. He hadn't been this close to another human being in 10 years. Part of him screamed to pull away, to put distance between himself and this intimacy he'd sworn off when Elizabeth died. This was too much, too close, too dangerous to the careful walls he'd built. But she was shivering. Even in sleep, her body trembled with cold that the blankets couldn't quite defeat. And he'd made a promise to her and to himself. Get her through winter. Keep her safe. Slowly, awkwardly, Jacob wrapped his arm around her and pulled her closer. Shared warmth, survival, nothing more. Clara settled against him immediately, her shivering gradually subsiding. Her breathing deepened, evened out. Jacob stared at the ceiling, at the play of firelight on rough-hewn beams. Elizabeth's face swam in his memory, not accusing but gentle. Approving, maybe. He'd loved his wife with everything he had, and losing her had nearly destroyed him. But she'd made him promise to live, really live, not just exist. He'd broken that promise for a decade. Maybe this was what living looked like. Helping someone who needed help. Sharing warmth on a frozen night. Being present for another human being instead of hiding from connection. Something in his chest, something that had been frozen solid for 10 years, cracked just slightly. Not breaking. Thawing. He closed his eyes and let himself sleep, holding a woman who needed holding, allowing himself to be needed. Outside, the blizzard raged. Inside, two people shared warmth and survived. Morning came gray and reluctant. The storm had passed, leaving the world buried under 4 feet of fresh snow. Clara woke to daylight filtering through frost-covered windows, to warmth, to the sound of animals shifting in their makeshift quarters. To Jacob's arms still around her. She went very still, awareness flooding through her. They'd slept this way all night. His body curved around hers, protective even in sleep. His face, usually so guarded, was peaceful in a way she'd never seen. The hard lines around his mouth had softened. He looked almost young. Clara felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. Not gratitude, though there was that. Not simple attraction, though she'd be lying if she said his strength didn't affect her. Something deeper. A recognition, maybe, of someone who understood what it meant to survive when the world wanted you broken. She carefully extracted herself, not wanting to wake him. Jacob's eyes opened immediately anyway, those storm gray eyes focusing on her with instant alertness. He sat up fast. "Storm over." His voice was all business, as if the intimacy of the night had never happened. Clara matched his tone, understanding instinctively that this was how he needed to handle it. Seemed so. They didn't speak of it, didn't acknowledge the shift. But something had changed between them, subtle as seasons turning. The weeks that followed brought spring's slow arrival. Snow began to melt, revealing brown earth and the first stubborn shoots of green. The days grew longer. Birds returned their songs, filling the morning air. And Clara, who had arrived at this mountain as a commodity to be used, began to transform into something else entirely. She worked alongside Jacob every day now, learning skills she'd never imagined needing. He taught her to check the trap lines, to read animal tracks in the melting snow. Rabbit tracks were paired prints, delicate and close together. Deer left cloven hooves, elegant crescents in mud. Wolf tracks were large and canine claw marks visible, and when they found those, Jacob's hand would rest on the rifle slung across his back. "Take what you need," he told her as he showed her how to set a snare. "Waste nothing. Respect the animal. It's giving its life so you can live. Don't make that sacrifice meaningless." Clara watched his hands, scarred and calloused, handle the wire with surprising gentleness. "Did your father teach you this?" Some learned more from Crow Indians in Montana Territory. They understood the mountain better than any white man I've met. It was the most he'd volunteered about his past. Clara treasured these small revelations, these glimpses into the man Jacob had been, before grief hollowed him out. They repaired the barn roof together, damaged by winter's weight. Jacob showed her how to measure boards, how to cut straight, how to nail without splitting the wood. She was strong, stronger than she'd ever given herself credit for. Years of hard work in the saloon, hauling water and scrubbing floors and lifting barrels, had built muscle her shame had never let her appreciate. When she held a roof beam steady while Jacob nailed it in place, he paused and looked at her with something like approval. "You've got good hands for this work. Steady." It was the first compliment anyone had given Clara about her body that wasn't backhanded or cruel. She felt warmth bloom in her chest, pride she'd thought beaten out of her. By the time they started on the garden, Clara had stopped asking permission for everything. She made suggestions. She disagreed when she thought Jacob was wrong. And he listened. Actually listened, considered her words, and often deferred to her judgment. "I'd like to try tomatoes," she said as they planned what to plant. Jacob frowned, examining the soil. "Frost will kill them. We're too high." "What if we built a cold-frame glass or oiled canvas over a wooden box? It would trap heat, protect them from late frosts." He paused, turning the idea over in his mind, then nodded. "Smart. We'll try it." The approval in his voice made Clara stand a little straighter. This was partnership. This was respect. This was so far from what she'd expected when Silas dragged her onto that auction block that it felt like living in a dream. But not everything was smooth. In April, Bessie the cow fell ill. She stopped eating, her eyes went dull, and she stood in the barn shaking. Jacob's face went grim when he examined her. "She's sick. Could infect Thunder, maybe the chickens. We need to slaughter her before it spreads. Preserve the meat, buy another cow come spring." The logic was sound, practical, the kind of hard decision that survival demanded. But Clara looked at Bessie, who'd given them milk all winter, who'd survived the blizzard huddled in the cabin with them, and something in her rebelled. "Let me try to treat her first, please." Jacob's jaw tightened. "Clara's sentiment doesn't survive up here. If she's dying anyway, better to salvage what we can." "I'm not being sentimental. I think I can help her." Clara met his eyes, refusing to back down. "My mother, before she died, she helped sick folks in our town. Taught me some things. Herbs that work? At least let me try." Jacob studied her for a long moment. She could see the calculation in his eyes, weighing risk against sentiment. Finally, he nodded. "1 week. If she's not better, we slaughter." Clara worked with desperate focus. She found yarrow in the woods, made a poultice for Bessie's swollen joints. She boiled willow bark into a bitter tea and forced the cow to drink it, knowing it would ease pain and reduce fever. She kept Bessie warm, clean, talking to her in soft tones that seemed to soothe the animal's distress. Jacob watched without interfering. On the third day, Bessie ate a few mouthfuls of grain. On the fifth day, her eyes brightened. By the seventh day, she was eating normally, the illness broken. Jacob stood in the barn doorway, watching Bessie chew her cud contentedly. You saved her. Clara was cleaning in the stall, her sleeves rolled up, hay stuck in her hair. We saved her. You gave me the chance to try him. Something shifted in Jacob's expression. Not quite a smile, but close. Didn't think it would work. But you let me try anyway. You were right. I was wrong. He said it simply, without ego. Won't be the last time. It was such a small thing, this admission. But it meant everything. In Clara's experience, men didn't admit to being wrong. They doubled down, got angry, made their pride more important than truth. But Jacob just acknowledged fact and moved on. It made Clara's throat tight with emotions she didn't have words for. May arrived with wildflowers carpeting the meadows and warm sunshine that finally drove the last of winter's chill from the air. Clara had been on the mountain for 4 months. 4 months that felt like a lifetime, like she'd become someone entirely new. She caught her reflection in the water bucket one morning and barely recognized herself. Her face had color from working outside. Her body still large, but now strong, with muscle, moved with confidence instead of shame. Her eyes, when they met her own gaze, held something that looked almost like contentment. Jacob found her there, staring at her reflection. Something wrong, Clara shook her head. Just thinking. I don't know who I am anymore. You're Clara Winters. He said it casually, then seemed to catch himself. Clara Hayes, sorry. But the slip lingered between them. Winters, not Hayes. His name, not her father's. The thought sent a shiver through Clara that had nothing to do with cold. That evening after supper, Jacob stood abruptly. He paced to the window, looked out at the mountains turning gold in the setting sun, then turned back to face her. His jaw worked like he was chewing on words, trying to find the right ones. Clara, sit down. Need to talk to you about something. Her stomach dropped. This was it. Spring had come, and he was going to tell her it was time to leave. Honor the agreement they'd made that first night. Give her money and send her on her way. She'd known this was coming, but the thought of leaving made her chest constrict with panic. She sat. Jacob sat across from her, his big hands flat on the table. He took a breath. When I brought you here 4 months ago, I made you a deal. Spring comes, you're free to leave. Spring's here. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. She nodded, not trusting her voice. But I'm hoping you won't. Her eyes snapped to his. He was looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. I need to tell you something first, though. You need to hear it before you decide anything. He reached across the table, took her hand. The touch was deliberate, the first time he'd initiated physical contact while awake since that blizzard night. His palm was warm, calloused, steady. I care about you, Clara. More than I've cared about anyone since I lost Elizabeth and Lily. Somewhere between teaching you to check trap lines and watching you save Bessie's life, you stopped being a responsibility and started being someone I can't imagine this mountain without. His voice roughened with emotion. But I need you to understand something. If we take this next step, it has to be your choice. Not because you feel grateful. Not because you're afraid of being alone again. Not because you think you owe me anything. He squeezed her hand gently. Only because you want it. Because you want me. Scars silence ghosts and all. He reached into his pocket with his free hand and pulled out a ring. Simple gold, worn smooth with age. The firelight caught it, made it glow. This was my mother's. Elizabeth wore it for the years we had together. His eyes met Clara's, direct and honest. If you'll have me, I'd be honored if you'd wear it too. Clara Hayes, will you marry me? The world stopped. Clara stared at him, at this man who'd bought her freedom and given her respect, who'd taught her she had worth, who'd never once made her feel like anything less than human. 4 months ago, she'd stood in shackles, believing she was nothing. Now a good man was asking her to be his wife, not because he owned her, because he chose her. Clara stood and Jacob stood too, worry flickering across his face like he thought she was leaving. Instead, she stepped close, cupped his bearded face in both hands, and looked directly into those storm-gray eyes. Jacob Winters, 4 months ago, I stood in shackles, believing I was nothing. You gave me freedom, respect, safety, and the space to remember I'm human. Her voice was clear, certain. I don't love you because I'm grateful, or because I'm afraid, or because I owe you. I love you because you're the first person who ever saw me. Not what the world said I was, but who I actually am. Well, tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling. You're quiet and stubborn, and you live on a mountain miles from anywhere. And I want nothing more than to spend the rest of my life right here with you. Yes, Jacob, I'll marry you. Relief crashed across his face like sunrise. He pulled her close, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other firm at the small of her back. Then he kissed her. Tentative at first, almost uncertain, like he'd forgotten how. Clara responded, her fingers sliding into his hair, holding him close. The kiss deepened, both of them breathing hard, years of loneliness and isolation falling away in the simple connection of two people choosing each other. When they finally broke apart, Clara was laughing and crying at the same time. Jacob rested his forehead against hers. We'll go to Lone Pine next week, he said, voice rough with emotion. Preacher comes through monthly. You deserve a proper wedding. Clara nodded. Jacob slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, like it had been waiting for her all along. That night they lay together by the fire, not yet as husband and wife, but as partners who'd chosen each other freely. Jacob held Clara's hand, feeling the ring under his thumb, thinking about promises. The ones he'd broken to the dead, and the ones he'd keep to the living. Above them, stars wheeled through endless sky. On the mountain, two broken people began to believe they might, against all odds, make each other whole. The week before the wedding passed in a blur of preparation. They rode to Lone Pine together, Clara seated in front of Jacob on Thunder, his arm around her waist, in a way that was now familiar, comforting. The town was larger than Bitter Creek, more established, with actual streets and a church. Helen Carson greeted them at the trading post with squeals of delight when she saw the ring on Clara's finger. I knew it. Jack, I told you, didn't I? They were meant for each other. Jack Carson grinned, slapping Jacob on the back hard enough to make him stumble. About time you rejoined the living, you stubborn bastard. Jacob actually smiled, a real smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Clara had never seen him look so young. Helen pulled Clara aside while the men discussed supplies. How do you feel, honey? Really happy, Clara said, and realized she meant it. Happier than I ever thought possible. You look wonderful, healthy, strong. Helen's eyes were kind. And Jacob, he's different too. Lighter somehow. You've been good for each other. The preacher, an elderly man with gentle eyes and weathered hands, agreed to perform the ceremony the following week. Helen insisted on helping Clara make a proper dress. They spent 2 days cutting and sewing blue cotton, simple but pretty, the first dress Clara had owned, that wasn't made from someone's cast-offs. When the day came, Clara stood in front of a small gathering, Helen and Jack as witnesses, wearing her blue dress and feeling like she was stepping into a new life. Jacob stood beside her in a clean shirt Jack had loaned him, looking nervous in a way Clara had never seen. His hands actually trembled when he took hers. The preacher spoke about partnership, about choosing to love through hardship and joy alike, about building a life on foundations of respect and trust. When he asked if Jacob took Clara as his wife, Jacob interrupted before the full question was finished. I do. Yes, the preacher chuckled. I hadn't finished the question, son. Don't need to. Answer's yes. When it was Clara's turn, her voice rang clear and certain. I do. They signed the certificate together. Clara wrote her name carefully, proudly. Jacob's signature was bold, decisive. Clara Hayes became Clara Winters with the scratch of a pen and the weight of a promise. Helen cried happy tears. Jack paid for a celebratory meal at the boarding house. And when the sun began to set, Jacob and Clara rode back up the mountain as husband and wife. Jacob carried her over the threshold despite her protests about her weight. You're my wife, he said firmly. This is tradition. He set her down gently in the cabin that was now their home. The fire was already lit, the bed piled with clean blankets. They stood looking at each other, suddenly shawning. Clara reached up and untied Jacob's collar. Her hands shook slightly. I've never done this before. I know. His voice was gentle. We go slow. You tell me if anything's wrong. What followed was tender, patient, nothing like the rough urgency Clara had feared. Jacob made her feel beautiful, desired, safe. His hands were reverent, his voice soft with reassurance. When it was over, they lay tangled in blankets, Clara's head on Jacob's chest, listening to his heartbeat slow. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. "Not a single one." "Good, because you're stuck with me now." Clara laughed. "I choose to be stuck with you. There's a difference." Summer unfolded in golden days and star-filled nights. They fell into the rhythms of married life with surprising ease. Working together felt natural, a partnership where each contributed strengths and compensated for weaknesses. Clara was better at planning and organizing tasks efficiently. Jacob was better at heavy labor at solving immediate physical problems. Together, they were formidable. In late July, Clara woke one morning and immediately had to run outside to vomit. Jacob found her leaning against the cabin wall, pale and shaking. "What's wrong? Are you sick?" Clara wiped her mouth, then looked at him with eyes that held equal parts fear and wonder. "I don't think so. I think I'm pregnant." Jacob went very still, so still that Clara's fears spiked. Then he pulled her into his arms, held her so tight she could barely breathe. "How do you feel about it?" His voice was thick. "Terrified and happy. Is that normal?" "I think so." He pulled back, cupped her face in both hands. "I'm terrified too." Because he was. Terrified of childbirth, of the thousand things that could go wrong. Elizabeth had almost died delivering Lily. His second child had taken Elizabeth's life before it could draw its first breath. The thought of losing Clara the same way made his blood run cold. But looking into her eyes, seeing her joy warring with fear, he knew he couldn't let his terror infect her hope. "We'll do this together," he said firmly. "I won't lose you, Clara. I swear it. We'll keep each other safe. That's how this works." The pregnancy progressed through late summer and into fall. Clara's belly grew round and firm. Jacob became protective to the point of absurdity, barely letting her lift anything heavier than a cup. Clara found it alternately endearing and infuriating. "Jacob, I'm pregnant, not dying." "I know, but—" He stopped himself, jaw working. Clara took his hand, placed it on her swelling belly. "You can't lose another family. I know. But you won't. I'm strong, Jacob. The baby's strong. Feel." Under his palm, the baby kicked. Strong, insistent, very much alive. Some of the tension left Jacob's shoulders. Helen visited in November, making the long trip up the mountain to check on Clara and teach her what to expect. She examined Clara with experienced hands, asked detailed questions, and pronounced everything normal and healthy. "You're built for this, Clara. Strong. You'll do fine." They prepared through the winter. Jacob built a cradle from pine, sanding it until the wood was smooth as silk, carving tiny flowers along the edges. Clara sewed blankets and tiny clothes, her hands shaking sometimes when she thought about holding a baby of her own. As February approached and Clara grew huge with child, Jacob's anxiety ratcheted up. He checked on her, constantly watched for any sign of distress, studied the medical book he'd bought in Lone Pine until he'd memorized every page about childbirth. Then late one night in the last week of February, riders appeared on the mountain trail. Clara was hanging laundry in the weak winter sunshine, 8 months pregnant and moving slowly. She spotted them first. 3 men on horseback moving with purpose up the narrow trail. Her stomach dropped. She knew that posture, that horse. "Silas." "Jacob." Her voice came out sharp with fear. "Jacob, someone's coming." Jacob emerged from the barn, took one look at her face and grabbed his rifle. "Get inside. Stay away from the windows." The riders emerged into the clearing. Silas Hayes sat astride the lead horse, looking older and meaner than Clara remembered. 2 rough-looking men flanked him, hands resting on gun belts. Their eyes were cold, professional. Hired guns. Jacob positioned himself on the porch, rifle held ready. "That's close enough. State your business." Silas dismounted, that familiar weasel grin spreading across his face. "Now, is that any way to greet family winners? I'm just here to check on my niece." "She's not your family. She's my wife, and you're not welcome here." "See, that's where you're wrong." Silas pulled a folded paper from his coat. "I've got new information. Turns out Clara's daddy owed more money than I thought. Found another promissory note. $400 this time." Jacob's eyes narrowed. "That's a lie." "Got it right here, signed and dated." Silas waved the paper. "Now, the law says debts pass to kin. Clara's the kin. Since she's married to you, well, that makes it your debt winners." His grin widened, showing teeth. So you can pay me 400 cash or I can claim equivalent assets. His eyes slid toward the cabin, toward where Clara's silhouette was visible in the window, her pregnant belly obvious. Maybe that baby when it comes. Work off the debt over, say, 15 years. Something in Jacob snapped. A cold rage settled over him, the kind he hadn't felt since the war. His voice when it came was deadly calm. You threaten my child, you die here. Today. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. Silas's hired gun shifted, reading the danger hands moving toward weapons. But before anyone could draw more, riders emerged from the tree line. Sheriff Brennan led them, two deputies flanking him, all armed. Behind them came Helen and Jack. Carson and three other families from Lone Pine. A small army gathered to defend their own. Lower your weapons, Silas, the sheriff called. You're done, Silas sputtered. This is a private matter. This stopped it being private when you threatened a pregnant woman and an unborn child. Sheriff Brennan rode forward, positioning his horse between Silas and the cabin. I've got 6 witnesses who just heard you attempt extortion and make threats against minors. Helen spoke up from horseback, her voice carrying clear and strong. And I've got testimony from 10 women about similar threats you've made over the years. We've been documenting your crimes, Silas. We have proof. Jack Carson added, Town Council voted yesterday. You're banned from Lone Pine and all surrounding settlements. Show your face, you get arrested. One of the other settlers, a man named Peterson, said firmly, We protect our own up here. Clara Winters is one of ours. The sheriff's hand rested on his pistol. Now you have 2 choices, Silas. Ride out, never come back, or I arrest you right now for attempted extortion, threatening minors, and about 6 other charges I can think of. He looked at the hired guns. That goes for you 2 as well. Leave or join him in jail. The guns exchanged glances. They were being paid to intimidate, not to die fighting a sheriff and armed citizens. Without a word, they turned their horses and rode away. Silas sat alone, surrounded and outmatched, his face twisted with impotent rage. This isn't over. Jacob stepped down from the porch rifle, aimed center mass at Silas. Yes, it is. You come near my family again, you even think about my family, and I will hunt you down myself. There won't be enough of you left to bury. Every word carried absolute conviction. Silas saw his own death in Jacob's eyes and believed it. He mounted his horse, smaller somehow, defeated. He rode away without another word, disappearing down the trail like a bad dream finally ending. The sheriff approached the cabin, tipping his hat to Clara, who'd emerged onto the porch. Sorry for the trouble, folks. I've been building a case against Silas for months. This was the last piece I needed. He's finished. To Clara specifically, his expression softened. Your testimony last year started people asking questions. Women coming forward. You changed things, Mrs. Winters. There's talk in the territorial legislature about changing the debt laws, making it illegal to sell people. They're calling it the Hayes-Winters Act. Clara's hand rested on her swollen belly, tears streaming down her face. I just wanted to protect my family. You did that and more. After everyone left, Jacob and Clara stood on their porch watching the last riders disappear down the trail. Clara's hand found Jacob's, their fingers interlacing as they'd done 100 times before. It's really over, Clara said, wonder in her voice. I'm really free. Jacob pulled her close, one arm around her shoulders, his other hand resting gently on her belly where their child moved. You were always free. You just had to claim it. Inside Clara, the baby kicked hard as if in agreement. Spring was coming. New life was coming. The shadow that had haunted Clara since her father's death was finally gone, riding away in defeat. On the mountain, wind whispered through the pines, carrying away the last traces of fear. And 2 people who'd chosen each other stood together, ready to face whatever came next. Not alone, never alone again. Together. March came with deceptive gentleness, warm days that promised spring before winter's final assault. Clara was 9 days past when Helen had predicted the baby would come, her belly enormous, her back aching with every movement. She'd stopped sleeping weeks ago, the baby's kicks keeping her awake, her body too uncomfortable to find rest. Jacob hovered constantly, his face lined with worry he tried to hide. He'd stopped checking trap lines, refused to leave the cabin for more than the time it took to tend the animals. At night, he sat in his chair by the fire rifle across his lap, watching Clara sleep in fitful bursts, waiting, worrying. The blizzard hit without warning on a Tuesday night. Clara woke to the sound of wind hammering the cabin walls, and a sensation she'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Wetness between her legs, a deep rolling ache low in her belly that felt like nothing she'd experienced before. She reached out in the darkness, found Jacob's shoulder. Jacob, it's time. He was awake instantly on his feet, lighting lamps with hands that shook despite his best efforts to stay calm. The cabin flooded with golden light. Through the windows, Clara could see nothing but white. Snow falling so thick and fast the world had disappeared. Jacob moved with practiced efficiency born of military training, but Clara saw the terror beneath the controlled movements. He built the fire into a roaring inferno, set water to boiling, laid out clean linens the knife he'd boiled that afternoon, string for the cord whiskey for disinfectant. But his face was pale, his jaw locked tight. When he came to help Clara from the loft to the bed below, his hands trembled. Jacob. She gripped his arm, made him look at her. I need you here with me, not lost in the past. Can you do that? His eyes met hers and she saw everything. The memory of Elizabeth's screams, the blood, the midwife's apologetic face, the tiny grave beside his wife's. I can't lose you, he said, voice breaking. You won't. Clara cupped his face in both hands, forced him to focus on her, on this moment instead of the ghosts. I'm not Elizabeth. This is different. But I need you here, Jacob. Present. Can you do that for me? He took a shuddering breath, nodded. I can do that. The labor started gently enough, contractions every 10 minutes, manageable pain that Clara breathed through while pacing the cabin. Jacob stayed close, his arm around her waist, supporting her weight when the contractions hit. Between pains, she rested, drank water, tried to conserve her strength. Outside, the storm intensified. Wind screamed around the cabin's corners. Snow piled against the walls in drifts that reached the windows. They were completely cut off alone on the mountain with no help coming. Just the two of them and the baby fighting to be born. As dawn broke gray and reluctant, the contractions grew stronger. Clara could no longer walk through them. She gripped Jacob's hands hard enough to leave marks, her breath coming in controlled huffs as each wave of pain crested and fell. Jacob wiped her forehead with a cool cloth, whispered encouragement in that rough voice. You're doing so well. So strong, Clara. I'm right here. Hours passed. The pain intensified until Clara felt like she was being torn apart from the inside. Sweat soaked her nightgown despite the cold. Her muscles trembled with exhaustion. The contractions came so close together now, she barely had time to breathe between them. Noon came and went. Clara's strength began to flag. Each contraction left her weaker, more drained. Fear crept in at the edges of her determination. I can't, she gasped during a particularly brutal contraction. Jacob, I can't do this. Jacob knelt beside the bed, eye level with her, his hands gripping hers. His voice was fierce, certain cutting through her panic. Yes, you can. Listen to me, Clara. You're the strongest person I know. You survived Silas, survived winter, survived everything life threw at you. His eyes blazed with conviction. You faced down armed men to protect this baby. You can bring that baby into the world. I believe in you. Clara stared at him through tears. What if something goes wrong? Then we face it together, but nothing's going wrong. He pressed his forehead to hers, their breath mingling. You're doing everything right. The baby's coming. Our baby, just a little longer. You can do this. She drew strength from his certainty, from the absolute faith in his voice. The next contraction came and she bore down, letting her body take over, trusting the ancient instinct that had brought life into the world since time began. Another hour passed. Clara's world narrowed to pain and effort, and Jacob's voice anchoring her to purpose. Then something shifted. The pressure changed, became urgent, impossible to resist. Jacob, her voice was desperate. The baby's coming now. He moved to position himself where he could catch the child, his hands steady despite the fear in his eyes. I'm here, I've got you. Push when you need to. Clara pushed, everything in her focused on this single task, bringing her child into the world. The pain was enormous, overwhelming, but behind it was purpose. Love. the fierce determination to meet the life she and Jacob had created. "I see the head." Jacob's voice cracked with emotion. "Dark hair, Clara, lots of it. One more push and the head will be out." Clara gathered every scrap of strength remaining. One more push, just one more. She bore down with everything she had felt the baby's head emerge in a rush of pressure and relief. "Stop," Jacob said urgently. "Don't push yet. Let me check the cord." The weight was agony. Every instinct screamed to finish this, to push the baby out. But Clara panted, trembling, trusting Jacob's hands. She felt his fingers, careful and quick. Then his exhale of relief. "Cord's clear. One more love. One more push, and we meet our baby." Clara pushed. The baby slid free into Jacob's waiting hands in a gush of fluid and blood. For one terrible moment, there was silence. Then the cabin filled with the thin, outraged wail of a newborn taking her first breath. Jacob's voice broke completely. "It's a girl. Clara, we have a daughter." He lifted the baby, tiny and red and perfect, and placed her on Clara's chest. Clara's arms came up automatically, cradling the small weight, looking down at the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. A little face eyes squeezed shut, mouth open in furious protest. Fists waving, alive. Healthy. Theirs. "Hello," Clara whispered through tears. "Hello, little one. We've been waiting for you." The baby's cries quieted at the sound of her mother's voice. She settled against Clara's skin, her tiny body relaxing into warmth and safety. Jacob worked with shaking hands, cleaning the baby gently, tying and cutting the cord. When the afterbirth came, and he checked that Clara wasn't bleeding too heavily, he finally let himself stop. Just stop and stare at his wife and daughter, both alive, both safe. He collapsed into the chair beside the bed, unable to speak for the emotion choking him. "Come hold your daughter," Clara said softly. Jacob approached like the baby was made of spun glass. He took the tiny bundle from Clara, and the moment his daughter settled into his arms, he broke. Tears streamed down his face, a decade of grief and fear and loss finally releasing. "She's perfect," he managed. "You're perfect, thank you." Hours later, when the baby slept in the cradle Jacob had built, Clara asked the question they'd discussed for months. What should we name her? They'd considered dozens of names, but nothing had felt right. Now, looking at their daughter's face, Clara knew. Rose, after Lily. Both flowers, honoring your first daughter while giving this one her own name. Jacob's breath caught. He looked at Clara with such gratitude, it made her heart ache. "You're sure? I'm sure, Rose Winters. It's perfect." Jacob bent and kissed first Clara's forehead, then their daughter's. "Welcome to the world, Rose. We promise to love you, keep you safe, teach you to be strong, like your mama." Baby Rose yawned a tiny squeaking sound and burrowed deeper into sleep. Outside, the blizzard finally broke. Pale sunlight filtered through thinning clouds, illuminating a world transformed by fresh snow. Clean, new, full of possibility. Inside the cabin, Jacob Winters held his wife and daughter and felt for the first time in 15 years complete. He'd lost one family to fever. Now he had another hard one chosen alive. The mountain had been his sanctuary from grief. Now it was home. The years that followed passed in the strange rhythm of family life where days felt endless, but years vanished like smoke. Rose grew from helpless infant to chubby baby to fierce toddler with dark hair and her father's gray eyes. She was curious, fearless, constantly getting into things she shouldn't. At 18 months, she tried to pet a wild rabbit. At 2, she climbed onto Thunder's back while the big horse stood in his stall, unconcerned by the tiny human clinging to his mane. Clara discovered she was pregnant again when Rose was a year and a half. This time the fear was less, replaced by confidence born of experience. She knew her body could do this. Knew Jacob would be there steady and strong. Samuel Winters was born in August of 1878, an easier birth with Helen present as midwife. He came into the world with a lusty cry and his mother's brown eyes healthy and loud. Rose was immediately possessive, patting her baby brother's head and declaring, "My baby," to anyone who would listen. Jacob with a son was different than Jacob with a daughter. He saw potential, someone to teach his skills to pass down knowledge of mountain and trap line. But he was also determined that Samuel learn more than survival. He wanted his son to understand that strength wasn't just physical, that kindness mattered as much as capability. The cabin expanded. Jacob built a second bedroom, then eventually a third. The garden grew larger, producing enough food to see them through harsh winters, with surplus to trade. The trap lines remained profitable. They weren't wealthy, but they were secure. In the summer of 1880, when Rose was 5 and Samuel 2, a stranger appeared on the mountain trail. Well-dressed Eastern, riding a fine horse and carrying a leather satchel. Jacob met him at the edge of the clearing, rifle ready. "State your business." The man dismounted carefully, hands visible and empty. "My name is Richard Hale. I'm a lawyer from Boston. I represent the estate of Elizabeth Sullivan Winters." Jacob went absolutely still. "My first wife." "Yes, sir, I apologize for the intrusion, but I need to speak with you about a matter of inheritance." They went inside. Clara made coffee, sent the children outside to play, and sat beside Jacob as Hale explained. Elizabeth's parents had been wealthy. When she'd run away to marry a nobody soldier, they disowned her in pride and anger. But they'd had no other children. When both parents died the previous year, their considerable estate had no direct heir, except potentially Lily Winters, Jacob's first daughter. "She died," Jacob said flatly. "Fever, same sickness that took Elizabeth. I buried them both." Hale nodded. "I'm not questioning that, sir, but I need documentation, death certificate, burial record, something definitive. The estate can't be settled without it." "We were in a mining camp in Montana Territory. There were no officials, no records. I marked the graves myself." "Then I need to ask if you'd be willing to take me there, to provide closure for the estate and perhaps for yourself." Jacob looked at Clara. She took his hand. "We'll go together." They left Rose and Samuel with Helen and Jack, made the week-long journey to Montana Territory. The mining camp was long, abandoned buildings collapsed or burned, nature reclaiming what humanity had briefly carved out. Jacob led them up into the hills to a spot overlooking a valley. Two simple wooden crosses stood, weathered but intact. The names were still legible. Elizabeth Winters, Lily Winters. Jacob knelt between the graves, his hand resting on earth that covered his first family. Clara stood close, but gave him space, understanding this was closure he'd never properly had. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you," Jacob said quietly. "Either of you. I'm sorry I left you here all these years." His voice roughened. "But I want you to know I didn't forget. I never forgot. And I'm living now, Elizabeth. Really living like I promised. I have a wife who chose me, 2 beautiful children, and I think you'd be happy for me." He stayed there for a long time. Clara didn't rush him. This was grief being honored, memories being treasured instead of buried. Hale photographed the graves, made careful notes. "This is sufficient documentation. Lily Winters, daughter of Elizabeth Sullivan Winters, is deceased. The estate will pass to the state as specified in the will." That night, camped near the graves, Hale pulled Jacob aside. "Elizabeth's parents left a letter with the estate for their granddaughter if she'd been found alive. Since that's not the case, I shouldn't share it. But I think you deserve to know what it said." Jacob braced himself. "Tell me." "They said they were wrong to disown Elizabeth. That pride and stubbornness had cost them their daughter, and they'd spent 20 years regretting it. They wanted to tell their granddaughter she came from love, even twisted love, and that she was worthy of everything. They were sorry they'd never get to tell her themselves." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Elizabeth would have appreciated that. She always hoped they'd come around. For what it's worth, they did, just too late. 2 months later, a letter arrived with a bank draft for $3,500. While the bulk of Elizabeth's parents' estate went to the state, they'd included a provision for any surviving family members of their beloved daughter. Hale had successfully argued that Jacob qualified. Jacob and Clara stared at the sum, trying to comprehend that much money. "What do we do with this?" Clara asked. Jacob looked around the cabin at Rose playing with wooden blocks he'd carved, at Samuel napping in his cradle. "We secure our children's future, buy more land so they have inheritance, put money aside for education, give them choices we never had." He paused. "And we help others, women in situations like you were in. Give them the same chance I gave you." They established a quiet fund working through Helen, who knew women in surrounding settlements who needed help. Escape money, travel funds, fresh starts. Over the next 8 years, they helped 15 women leave abusive situations and begin new lives. In the fall of 1885, when Rose was 10 and Samuel 7, Silas Hayes returned one final time. He'd served 10 years in territorial prison, released gaunt and bitter, everything he'd owned lost. His sons wanted nothing to do with him. No town would give him work. He'd lost everything, and he blamed Jacob and Clara for all of it. He came with 2 hired gunsmen as desperate and broken as he was. No legal pretense this time, just revenge. Jacob spotted them from the barn, his gut tightening with familiar alertness. He grabbed his rifle, moved to position himself between the riders and the cabin where Clara was teaching the children their letters. "That's far enough," he called. "State your business or leave." Silas dismounted, his grin more grimace than smile. "You cost me everything, Winters. 10 years in prison. My sons won't speak to me. No town will let me work. I've got nothing left." "You did that to yourself. Now leave." "Not until you pay. $500 or I burn your cabin to the ground." "Your choice." Jacob's voice went cold and flat. "You threaten my family, you die. Last warning." The hired guns' hands moved toward their weapons. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, violence about to erupt. Then horses emerged from the tree line. Not 2 or 3, but a dozen. Sheriff Brennan led them, deputies at his side. Helen and Jack Carson rode behind. 4 other families from Lone Pine, all armed, all grim-faced. "Lower your weapons, Silas." The sheriff's voice carried absolute authority. "You're outnumbered and outgunned. This is private business." Helen spoke up, her voice sharp as broken glass. "This stopped at being private when you threaten children. We know what you are, Silas Hayes, and we protect our own." Jack added, "Town council voted. You're banned from 3 counties. Show your face, you get arrested." One of the other settlers, a rancher named Peterson, whose sister the fund had helped, said firmly, "Clara and Jacob helped my family when we had nothing. Shared supplies when we were starving. We don't forget that kind of decency." Another woman, Martha Green, whose niece the fund had helped escape an abusive husband, added, "They've helped more people than you'll ever know. Quiet help, asking nothing in return. That's the kind of neighbors we value." Sheriff Brennan looked at Silas with disgust. "See the difference? You made enemies. They made community. Now you have 2 choices. Ride them out and never come back, or I arrest you for attempted arson, extortion, and threatening minors." Silas's hired guns exchanged glances. They were being paid in promises by a man who had nothing. This wasn't worth dying for. Without a word, they turned their horses and disappeared down the trail. Silas sat alone on his horse, surrounded by armed citizens who'd gathered to protect their neighbors. Smaller somehow, defeated. "This isn't over," he tried weakly. Jacob stepped forward, rifle steady. "Yes, it is. You come near my family again, you even think about them, and I will hunt you down myself. There won't be enough of you left to bury." He meant it, every word. Silas saw his own death in those gray eyes and believed it utterly. He turned his horse and rode away, a broken man disappearing into obscurity. After everyone left, Jacob and Clara stood on their porch with their children. Rose and Samuel had watched everything from the window, old enough now to understand what had happened, young enough to still feel shaken by it. Jacob knelt, gathering both children into his arms. "Listen to me, both of you. What you saw today was a bad man trying to hurt people who'd done him no wrong. But you also saw good people standing together to stop him. Remember, this one person alone can be overcome. But a community that cares for each other, that protects each other, that's stronger than any amount of hate or greed." Rose, serious beyond her years, asked, "Why did all those people come to help us?" Clara answered, kneeling beside Jacob, "Because we helped them when they needed it. Not for reward or recognition, just because it was right. And when we needed help, they remembered. That's how community works." Samuel, always more direct, asked, "Is the bad man gone forever?" "Yes," Jacob said with absolute certainty. "He's gone." The children accepted this, reassured by their father's confidence. They ran off to play, resilient in the way of the young. Jacob and Clara remained on the porch, watching the sunset over mountains that had witnessed everything. "We did it," Clara said softly. "Built something that lasts." Jacob pulled her close. "We're still building it." 3 years later, in the summer of 1888, the territorial legislature passed the Hayes-Winters Protection Act. It became illegal across Wyoming territory to sell human beings to settle debts. The practice that had put Clara on that auction block was now banned, punishable by prison time. News reached them via Helen, who rode up the mountain with the official notice and tears of joy on her face. Clara read the document 3 times, unable to quite believe it. "We changed the law," she whispered. "You changed the law," Jacob corrected. "Your courage that day, you stood up to Silas, your testimony, your refusal to stay silent. That started conversations. People saw a woman fight back and win. It mattered." By then, their family had grown again. Grace had been born in 1882, a quiet baby who became an observant child. Nathaniel arrived in 1884, a whirlwind of energy and mischief. The cabin had expanded multiple times now, a sprawling home with 5 rooms, a real kitchen, and a porch that wrapped around 2 sides. On an evening in late summer, with all 4 children playing in the yard, Jacob and Clara sat on that porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. Rose was 13 now, tall and confident, teaching Samuel to track deer sign in the woods. Samuel at 10 was his father's shadow, learning everything Jacob could teach about surviving in wild country. Grace at 6 was already showing her mother's gift with growing things, tending a small garden plot of her own. Nathaniel at 4 was into everything fearless and charming in equal measure. "Think we're done?" Clara asked, one hand on her still flat belly. Jacob looked at her sharply, hope and concern warring in his expression. "Are you, not sure yet. Maybe. Would you mind if we were—" He took her hand, brought it to his lips. "I'd mind losing you. The number of children doesn't matter. You matter. Us, this family, this life we built. That's what matters." Clara leaned her head on his shoulder, comfortable in the way of people who'd shared 15 years of joy and struggle. "Do you ever think about that day at the auction? Every day. Do you regret it?" Jacob was quiet for a moment, considering. "Best $200 I ever spent. Though it wasn't about the money, was it? What was it about? Seeing someone the world said was worthless and knowing they were wrong. Seeing you hold your chin up, even in chains, and thinking that's someone worth knowing. Someone worth fighting for." He squeezed her hand. "Turned out I was right." Rose ran up to the porch, breathless and excited. "Papa, can you tell us the story about how you met Mama?" The other children gathered, immediately settling on the porch steps with the eagerness of those who'd heard the tale before. But never tired of it. This was tradition now, this story, their origin myth. Jacob glanced at Clara, who nodded permission. He gathered his thoughts, choosing words carefully. "Your mother stood on an auction block in chains. The world said she was worthless, something to be bought and sold. I saw different. Saw strength, saw dignity, saw worth that couldn't be bought or sold." He looked at each child in turn. "I paid $200 for her freedom, brought her to this mountain, and she chose of her own free will to stay. Not because she had to, because she wanted to." To Rose specifically, he said, "Remember this, your worth isn't determined by what others say. It's determined by who you choose to be." To Samuel, "Real strength isn't in muscles or guns. It's in protecting those who can't protect themselves." To Grace and Nathaniel, "You came from love, from 2 people who chose each other freely. That choice matters more than anything." Clara added, her voice soft but firm. "And remember this too, freedom isn't just given, it's claimed. Once you claim it, you fight to keep it, for yourself and for others." The sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. The children, satisfied with the story they'd heard countless times, ran off to catch fireflies in the gathering dusk. Their laughter echoed across the clearing. Jacob and Clara remained on the porch, hands linked, watching their children play. 15 years had passed since that January day when a hollow man had seen a woman in chains and made a choice. 15 years of building a life from nothing but determination and hope. 15 years of love chosen daily, not once, but over and over again. "We did all right," Jacob said quietly. Clara smiled. "We did better than all right. We did magnificently." She thought about that girl on the auction block, shackled and shamed, certain she was worthless. Thought about the woman she'd become. Wife, mother, advocate. A woman whose courage had changed laws, whose strength had built a family, whose choice to claim freedom had rippled outward in ways she was still discovering. "Sometimes I can barely remember being her," Clara said. "The girl who believed all the cruel things they said. She's still part of you, the foundation everything else was built on." "Maybe, but she was so scared, Jacob. So convinced she was nothing." Jacob turned to face her fully, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. And now you know better. That's the difference. Now you know your worth isn't something other people give you. It's something you claim for yourself. Clara covered his hand with hers. You helped me learn that. You taught yourself. I just gave you the space to do it. The first stars emerged in the darkening sky. Inside the cabin, lamps glowed warm and golden. The children's laughter grew quieter as they tired, ready to come inside for supper and stories before bed. The mountain stood eternal, watching over the cabin where broken people had found each other and built something magnificent, where chains had been shattered and shame transformed into strength, where two people had chosen each other freely, and in that choice had changed not just their own lives, but the lives of countless others. The legacy wasn't in laws or money or land, though those mattered. The legacy was in the choosing, in the daily decision to see each other's worth, to stand together against cruelty, to build rather than destroy. The legacy was in four children who would carry forward the values their parents had lived, who would teach their own children that every person has inherent dignity, that freedom once claimed must be fiercely protected, that community matters more than individual gain. The legacy was love, not the easy kind that costs nothing but the hard kind. The kind that chooses to stay when leaving would be simpler. The kind that fights for others even when there's no personal gain. The kind that transforms not through grand gestures, but through 10,000 small acts of respect and care. As darkness settled fully and the children came inside, their voices filling the cabin with noise, and life, Jacob pulled Clara close one more time. No regrets, he asked, a question that had become tradition between them. Not a single one of my means. Clara answered the same response she'd given on their wedding night and 100 times since. You buy one? Just one. She looked up at him surprised. What? That I waited 10 years after Elizabeth died. That I almost missed this. Almost missed you. Clara's eyes burned with sudden tears. But you didn't miss it. You were there when it mattered. You saw me when no one else did. Lucky for both of us, I went to town that day. Lucky for me, I'm not sure what you got out of it. Jacob laughed, a sound that had become more common over the years, but still held the power to make Clara's heart lift. What did I get? Let me think. A partner who tells me when I'm being stubborn. A wife who saves my livestock with herbs and determination. 4 children who fill this cabin with chaos and joy. A reason to live instead of just exist. He kissed her forehead. Yeah, I definitely got the short end of that deal. They stood in the doorway together, watching their children settle in for the evening. Rose was already reading to the younger ones, her voice clear and confident. Samuel was carving a stick, his hands careful and steady. Grace was drawing in the margins of an old book. Nathaniel was falling to sleep on the rug, fighting it but losing. This was the life they'd built. Not perfect, not easy, but theirs. Chosen. Claimed. Worth every struggle, every fear, overcome every moment of doubt conquered. The mountain winds sang through the pines, carrying stories of redemption and choice and love hard won. And in the cabin, a family lived those stories every day. Not because they were special or chosen by fate, but because they chose each other. Daily, deliberately, with full knowledge of the peace and absolute certainty of the value. Freedom, Clara had learned, wasn't a destination. It was a practice, a choice made over and over again. She'd claimed hers on a mountain in Wyoming territory with the help of a man who saw her worth when the world saw none. And in claiming it, she'd helped others claim theirs. That was legacy. That was love. That was life truly lived. The story that began on an auction block in chains ended here, in warmth and safety and family. But it wasn't really an ending at all. It was a beginning that continued generation after generation in every person who chose freedom, who stood up to cruelty, who saw worth in others that the world overlooked. The mountain stood eternal. The cabin glowed with light and life. And the choice to love, to fight, to live with dignity and purpose echoed forward through time like ripples spreading from a stone dropped in still water. Some stories end. This one transformed, growing larger with each retelling. Each life changed, each person who heard it, and decided that they too could choose freedom, could claim worth, could build something beautiful from broken pieces. The legacy was carved not in stone but in hearts, and it would last forever.